January 1967, Quang Tri Province. A Marine squad is pinned down in the elephant grass. The air is thick with humidity. The mosquitoes are relentless. A K-47 fire cracks through the vegetation. The Marines return fire. But then the sound changes. Instead of the sharp report of the M16, there is a different noise. Click, click, click. The sound of a weapon that has stopped being a weapon. The sound of a rifle that has become a paperweight. The sound of death approaching. The Marine pulls the charging handle. Nothing. He slaps the bottom of the magazine. Nothing. He reaches for the cleaning rod that should be in his gear. It is not there. Nobody gave him a cleaning rod. Nobody told him he would need one. He looks at the spent brass case jammed in the chamber of his rifle. He looks at his hands. He looks at the tree line where the enemy is advancing. He is holding the most advanced infantry rifle ever designed by American engineers, and he cannot fire it. He has grenades. He has a K-bar knife. He has his bare hands. But his rifle, the M16, the weapon that was supposed to give him superiority over the enemy, is useless, and he is about to die because of it. In the next 3 years, this scene will repeat itself thousands of times across the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam. Letters home will tell of rifles that jam. Mothers will receive packages from their sons requesting cleaning supplies that the United States Army has failed to provide. Congressional hearings will expose a scandal so profound that it will shake the Pentagon to its foundations. The M16 will become the most hated rifle in American military history. Soldiers will throw down their issued weapons and pick up the enemy's AK-47s. They will risk court-martial for the crime of survival. They will write home in anger and desperation. But here is the truth that nobody wanted to admit. The M16 did not fail in Vietnam. The gun worked exactly as designed. What failed was every single institution, every bureaucrat, every general, and every corporate executive who touched it between the factory floor and the firefight. The M16's failure was not a story of faulty engineering. It was a story of institutional arrogance, cost-cutting corruption, and the kind of bureaucratic negligence that gets young men killed. This is the untold story of how the United States military took a revolutionary weapon and turned it into a death trap. This is the story of the men who died holding jammed rifles, and this is the story of the systematic failure that caused it all. The rifle that should have changed everything. To understand the catastrophe, you have to understand the weapon. The M16 was not an accident of design. It was the product of one man's vision to revolutionize infantry combat. Eugene Morrison Stoner did not come from the traditional gun design establishment. He was not a product of Springfield Armory or the Army's Ordnance Corps. He was a California machinist who had worked his way up from installing armament on aircraft during World War II. After the war, he ended up at a small design house called Armalite, a division of Fairchild Aircraft. Armalite was not in the business of making guns. They were in the business of designing them and selling the patents. In 1955, Stoner was given a challenge. The United States Army wanted a new battle rifle. The M1 Garand had won World War II, but it was heavy. It held only 8 rounds. It fired a massive cartridge that kicked like a mule. The Army had just adopted the M14, a souped-up Garand with a 20-round magazine and selective fire capability. But the M14 was still heavy. It was still hard to control on full automatic, and it still fired the same powerful cartridge that dated back to the First World War. Stoner thought there was a better way. He started with a radical premise. Infantry combat had changed. In World War II, The average engagement distance was 300 meters. Studies showed that most firefights happened at ranges under 200 meters. Soldiers did not need to kill the enemy at 800 meters. They needed to put a lot of rounds downrange quickly and accurately at close range. So Stoner asked a simple question. What if you made the bullet smaller? What if you made the rifle lighter? What if you used new materials like aluminum and fiberglass instead of wood and heavy steel? What if you designed the entire system around controllability and rapid fire instead of raw hitting power? The result was the AR-15. It was revolutionary. It weighed less than 7 pounds. A soldier could carry twice as much ammunition as he could with the M14. The rifle fired a tiny cartridge, the 5.56 millimeter round, which weighed a fraction of the old 7.62 millimeter NATO round. But that tiny bullet did something terrifying when it hit a human body. It traveled at supersonic speeds. When it struck flesh, it tumbled and fragmented. It created massive wound channels. It was lethal. And because the recoil was so light, a soldier could actually control the weapon on full automatic. He could put aimed shots on target. He could engage multiple enemies rapidly. The AR-15 made every rifleman into a one-man firebase. Stoner's design was elegant. He used a direct gas impingement system. Gas from the fired round was tapped from the barrel and sent directly back to the bolt carrier. This eliminated the need for a heavy piston system. It made the rifle lighter. It made the recoil impulse travel in a straight line back into the shooter's shoulder, which improved accuracy. The entire rifle was modular. It could be field-stripped in seconds. The upper and lower receivers were made of aircraft-grade aluminum. The handguards and stock were made of space-age composite materials. It looked like something from the future. Soldiers who first saw it called it the Mattel rifle because it looked like a toy. But it was not a toy. Early field tests in Vietnam were astonishing. In 1962, the AR-15 was issued to Special Forces units and South Vietnamese troops. They loved it. Reports came back describing the weapon's lethality and reliability. One ARVN soldier was quoted saying that the rifle gave his men the confidence to stand and fight instead of retreating. The CIA purchased thousands of AR-15 rifles for covert operations. Air Force security units adopted it. Airborne units requested it. Everyone who actually used the rifle in combat wanted more. The effectiveness of the AR-15 in its early trials was almost miraculous. Green Berets operating in the Central Highlands reported that the lightweight rifle allowed them to carry more ammunition on long-range patrols. The reduced recoil meant that even smaller-statured Vietnamese soldiers could control the weapon effectively. In firefights, the high-velocity rounds proved devastating. When enemy soldiers were hit, they went down and stayed down. The wounds were catastrophic. The tumbling effect of the bullet created massive trauma. Viet Cong fighters who had shrugged off hits from pistol rounds or even some rifle rounds were stopped immediately by the tiny 5.56 millimeter bullet traveling at supersonic speeds. One report from a Special Forces advisor described an engagement where a small ARVN unit armed with AR-15Es successfully defended against a much larger Viet Cong force. The soldiers were able to lay down such a high volume of accurate fire that the enemy assault faltered and broke. The advisor noted that with the old M1 carbines, the same unit would have been overrun. The AR-15 had changed the equation. It had given the defenders firepower that previously required crew-served weapons. The psychological impact on friendly forces was equally important. South Vietnamese soldiers who had been issued the AR-15 felt empowered. They felt like they had a technological advantage. They felt like their American allies were giving them the best equipment available. This confidence translated into better combat performance. Units armed with the AR-15 showed higher morale and were more willing to engage the enemy aggressively. The rifle became a status symbol. Soldiers wanted it. Units competed to get it. Meanwhile, captured Viet Cong documents revealed that enemy commanders had taken notice of the new weapon. They described it with a mixture of fear and respect. They instructed their troops to target soldiers carrying the black rifles first, because they represented the greatest threat. They noted that the wounds caused by the AR-15 were far more severe than those caused by other weapons. They warned their fighters that engaging forces armed with the AR-15 required different tactics, more concealment, greater caution. The enemy respected the rifle, and that respect was earned through combat effectiveness. But the United States Army did not want the AR-15. The Army's ordnance establishment had just spent 10 years developing the M14. They had factories tooled up. They had doctrine written. They had an entire logistics system built around the 7.62 millimeter NATO cartridge. And now, some civilian engineer from California was telling them that everything they had done was obsolete. The Army brass hated the AR-15. They hated the small caliber. They hated the plastic furniture. They hated that it represented a rejection of everything they believed about rifle design. So they tried to kill it. The rig tests and the political battle. In 1962, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered a series of comparative tests. The M14, the AR-15, and the enemy's AK-47 would be evaluated side by side. McNamara was a numbers man. He believed in quantitative analysis. He wanted data. The Army conducted the tests, and the Army made sure the results favored the M14. They used match-grade M14 rifles tuned to perfection. They used AR-15EO wind straight out of the box. They designed tests that emphasized long-range accuracy, where the larger caliber M14 excelled. They minimized tests of controllability on full automatic, where the AR-15 dominated. The report came back recommending the M14. But McNamara was suspicious. He ordered the Army Inspector General to investigate. The Inspector General confirmed what everyone already knew. The tests had been rigged. The Army Materiel Command had deliberately stacked the deck against the AR-15. The testers were biased. The methodology was flawed. It was a bureaucratic ambush. McNamara was furious. In January 1963, he made a decision that would send shockwaves through the military establishment. He ordered a halt to M14 production. He ordered the adoption of the AR-15. The rifle would be redesignated as the M16, and it would become the standard infantry weapon for all services. The Army was forced to comply. But they complied in the most dangerous way possible. They agreed to adopt the M16, but they insisted on modifications. They wanted a forward assist, a mechanism to manually force the bolt closed if it failed to chamber a round. Eugene Stoner hated this modification. He argued that if a round would not chamber on its own, forcing it was dangerous. The forward assist was a solution to a problem that did not exist. But the Army insisted. They got their forward assist, and in the process, they created two variants of the rifle. The Air Force got the M16 without the forward assist. The Army and Marines got the XM16E1 with the forward assist. Then came the ammunition decision. Stoner had designed the AR-15 around a specific type of gunpowder. It was called IMR stick powder, manufactured by DuPont. It was an extruded powder that burned cleanly and produced consistent pressure curves. Stoner had tested the rifle extensively with this powder. The rifle's gas system was calibrated for it. The cyclic rate of fire was tuned for it. Everything worked. But in 1964, the Army made a fateful decision. They needed to produce millions of rounds of ammunition quickly. DuPont could not meet the demand for IMR stick powder, so the Army contracted with Olin Corporation to produce ammunition using a different propellant. It was called WC-846 ball powder. On paper, the ball powder produced the same muzzle velocity as the stick powder. The ballistics looked identical, but ball powder burned differently. It burned hotter. It burned dirtier. It produced more carbon fouling. And critically, it generated higher peak pressures, which increased the cyclic rate of fire of the M16 from around 750 rounds per minute to over 1,000 rounds per minute. This higher rate of fire increased wear on parts. It increased the likelihood of malfunctions, and the increased fouling from the dirtier powder began to gum up the gas system and the chamber. Eugene Stoner warned the Army that the M16 would not function as reliably with ball powder. His warnings were ignored. Then came the cost-cutting decisions. The original AR-15 design called for chrome plating the barrel chamber and bore. Chrome plating prevented corrosion. It made extraction easier. It was standard on rifles used in humid, tropical environments. The Army knew about chrome plating. They had used it on previous rifles, but chrome plating cost money. It added time to the manufacturing process, and the Army was in a hurry to get rifles into the field. So, they made a decision. The M16 would not have a chrome-plated chamber or bore. The manufacturer, Colt, argued against this decision. Stoner argued against it, but the Army overruled them. The M16 would deploy to Vietnam with bare steel chambers. And then came the final, fatal decision. The Army decided that the M16 was a self-cleaning rifle. This was not Stoner's claim. This was marketing language that somehow migrated from Colt's advertising materials into official Army doctrine. The rifle was made of modern materials. It had tight tolerances. It was a precision instrument. Therefore, the Army reasoned, it did not need much maintenance. Cleaning kits were expensive. Training took time. The rifle was going to soldiers in the field immediately. So the decision was made. The M16 would be issued without cleaning kits, without bore rods, without chamber brushes, without instruction manuals on how to maintain the weapon. Soldiers who had trained on the M14 for their entire basic training cycle would arrive in Vietnam, be handed an M16, and be told that it was a self-cleaning rifle that required minimal maintenance. They would be sent into combat with this information, and they would die because of it. The killing fields of 1965 to 1967. The first M16 arrived in Vietnam in early 1965. They went to elite units, air cavalry, Marines, airborne. At first, everything seemed fine. The rifle worked. Soldiers loved the lightweight. They loved the high rate of fire. They loved the lethality. But after a few weeks in the field, the reports began to change. Rifles were jamming, not occasionally, not rarely, constantly. The most common malfunction was called failure to extract. A soldier would fire a round. The rifle would cycle. But the spent brass cartridge case would remain stuck in the chamber. The extractor would tear the rim off the case, leaving the case body wedged in the chamber. The rifle was now a single-shot weapon until the case could be removed, and the only way to remove it was to insert a cleaning rod down the barrel and knock the case out from the muzzle end. But the soldiers did not have cleaning rods. They had not been issued cleaning rods. They had not been told they would need cleaning rods, so they improvised. They used sticks. They used pieces of wire. They used the cleaning rods from their dead enemies' AK-47s. They wrote home, begging their families to send cleaning supplies. The letters were desperate. One Marine wrote home, "Out of 40 rounds I have fired, my rifle jammed about 10 times. I pack as many grenades as I can, plus bayonet and K-bar, so I will have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a brush. I need it. Our rifles are getting a lot of guys killed because they jam so easily." The desperation in these letters is palpable. These were young men, most barely out of their teens, who had been trained to believe in the superiority of American equipment. They had been told they would have the best weapons, the best training, the best support. And now they were begging their mothers to mail them cleaning supplies because their military had failed to provide them. The letters described watching friends die because their rifles jammed at the critical moment. They described the sickening feeling of pulling the trigger and hearing nothing but a click. They described the terror of trying to clear a malfunction while under fire, knowing that every second spent fighting with the rifle was a second they could not fight back against the enemy. Some soldiers described elaborate rituals they had developed to keep their rifles functioning. They would disassemble and clean their weapons multiple times per day. They would use anything they could find as lubricant, gun oil if they could get it, motor oil from vehicles, even cooking oil or insect repellent in desperate situations. They would obsessively check their chambers before every patrol. They would carry extra magazines because the springs in the issued magazines were weak and caused feeding problems. They would test-fire their weapons before missions to make sure they were working, wasting precious ammunition just to gain some confidence that when they needed their rifle it might actually fire. Others described the psychological burden of carrying a weapon they could not trust. They talked about the constant anxiety. Every time they went on patrol, every time they set up an ambush, every time they moved through dangerous terrain, there was a voice in the back of their mind asking, "Will the rifle work when I need it?" Some soldiers admitted that they hesitated to engage the enemy because they were afraid their rifle would jam and leave them defenseless. They would see a target, start to squeeze the trigger, and pause just for a second, thinking about what would happen if the rifle failed. That hesitation could be fatal, but the fear of a jammed rifle was so great that it overrode their training and their instincts. The improvised solutions became part of the culture. Experienced soldiers would teach new arrivals the tricks for keeping their M16s running. They would share improvised cleaning tools. They would trade information about which cleaning solvents worked best. They would demonstrate techniques for clearing the most common malfunctions. This knowledge should have come from the Army. It should have been part of basic training. But instead, it was being transmitted through informal networks of survival, soldier to soldier, in the field, under fire. The failures were happening in the worst possible moments. Contact with the enemy, ambushes, firefights. A soldier would engage the enemy. His rifle would jam. He would be defenseless. His squad would have to cover for him while he frantically tried to clear the malfunction. Or they would find him later, dead, with a jammed rifle in his hands and a cleaning rod stuck down the barrel. The stories spread. Trust in the weapon evaporated. Marines and soldiers began to pick up AK-47s from dead enemy soldiers. They carried them as backup weapons. They risked courts-martial for the offense of carrying enemy weapons. But they did it anyway, because they trusted the AK-47 more than they trusted their issued M16s. The complaints reached the chain of command. Officers reported the malfunctions up the line. The reports reached Saigon. They reached the Pentagon. And the institutional response was denial. The Army insisted the problems were user error. Soldiers were not maintaining their weapons properly. They were not following procedures. The rifle was fine. The soldiers were the problem. More training was needed. More discipline was needed. But no changes would be made to the rifle or the ammunition. Then, in March 1967, the story broke public. The Washington Daily News published letters from soldiers describing the M16 failures. The letters were heartbreaking. They described watching friends die because their rifles jammed. They described the terror of going into combat with a weapon they knew would fail. One letter described a Marine who was found dead with his rifle disassembled, trying to clear a malfunction when he was killed. The public was outraged. Mothers and fathers whose sons were serving in Vietnam demanded answers. Members of Congress received bags of mail. The pressure became unbearable. Congressman Richard E. Cord of Missouri, chairman of a special subcommittee, launched an investigation. The I-Cord Committee held hearings in the summer of 1967. They interviewed soldiers. They interviewed engineers. They interviewed Army officials. And what they uncovered was a scandal of staggering proportions. The Army had known about the ammunition problem. Colt had warned them. Stoner had warned them. Field reports had documented it. But the Army had done nothing. The Army had known about the lack of chrome plating. They had been warned repeatedly that bare chambers would fail in humid environments, but they had ignored the warnings to save money. The Army had known that soldiers were not being issued cleaning kits. They had known that training was inadequate, but they had rushed the rifle into service anyway. The hearings became a media sensation. Television cameras captured the testimony. Newspapers ran front-page stories. The American public watched as the facade of military competence crumbled. Soldiers testified about the fear they felt going into combat with weapons they knew would fail. They described the improvised solutions they had developed. One Marine described using dental floss to pull stuck cases out of chambers. Another described trading cigarettes with ARV forces to get cleaning supplies. A third described writing home to ask his father to send gun oil and bore brushes because the military had not provided them. The technical testimony was equally damning. Ballistics experts explained how the change from stick powder to ball powder had increased chamber pressures and fouling rates. They showed photographs of chambers caked with carbon deposits. They demonstrated how a rifle that had not been properly cleaned would fail within 100 rounds. They explained that chrome plating had been standard practice for decades precisely because military rifles operated in harsh environments where corrosion was inevitable. They testified that the decision not to chrome plate the M16 was inexplicable given everything the Army knew about metallurgy and tropical operations. The hearings revealed that a Marine had been killed because he was the only member of his squad with a cleaning rod, and he had gone to help clear other Marines' jammed rifles when he was shot. His mother testified. She read the letter from her son's commanding officer. The letter praised her son's bravery. It described how he had died, trying to help his fellow Marines. It did not mention that the reason he had been helping them was that their rifles had jammed. It did not mention that the jamming was preventable. It did not mention that the military had failed to provide basic cleaning equipment. She wept as she read the letter. The committee room was silent. The television cameras captured every moment. America watched a mother grieve for a son who had died not from enemy bullets, but from bureaucratic negligence. The hearings revealed that the change from stick powder to ball powder had never been properly tested. The Army had simply assumed it would work. They had looked at the ballistic data on paper. Velocity looked the same. Pressure looked acceptable. So they had approved the change. Nobody had conducted extended firing tests under field conditions. Nobody had evaluated the cumulative effects of the dirtier burning powder. Nobody had asked Eugene Stoner what he thought. They had made a decision based on manufacturing convenience and cost, and they had not considered the consequences. The hearings revealed that the lack of chrome plating was a deliberate cost-cutting measure, approved at the highest levels. Witnesses testified that chrome plating would have added approximately $5 per rifle to the manufacturing cost. $5. That was the price difference between a rifle that worked and a rifle that jammed in the jungle humidity. The Army had decided that saving $5 per rifle was more important than preventing malfunctions. When asked to justify this decision, Army officials stammered and deflected. They claimed that field testing had shown chrome plating was not necessary, but the field testing they referenced had been conducted in temperate climates with clean rifles. It had not simulated Vietnam conditions. The hearings revealed that the myth of the self-cleaning rifle had been perpetuated despite clear evidence that it was false. Marketing materials from Colt had claimed the rifle required minimal maintenance. Army training materials had repeated this claim. Instructors at basic training had told recruits that the M16 was so advanced it barely needed cleaning. All of this was wrong, but it had been convenient. It had saved the time and expense of developing cleaning kits and training programs. It had allowed the Army to rush the rifle into service faster, and it had gotten soldiers killed. Eugene Stoner himself testified. He explained that the AR-15 had been designed and tested with stick powder. He explained that he had warned the Army about ball powder. He explained that he had recommended chrome plating. He explained that the rifle needed regular cleaning like any other precision instrument. And he was ignored. The generals testified. They defended their decisions. They claimed the rifle was sound. They claimed the problems were exaggerated. They claimed that proper training would solve everything. But the data contradicted them. Soldiers in the field were experiencing malfunction rates of 20 to 30%. Some units reported that 50% of their rifles were non-functional at any given time. This was not user error. This was systematic failure, the emergency fixes, and the cover-up. The ICORD Committee's report was damning. It laid out in precise detail every failure of judgment, every corner cut, every warning ignored, the political pressure forced action. In late 1967, the Army finally began to make the changes that should have been made from the beginning. Chrome plating was authorized for the chamber, initially just the chamber, not the full bore. That would come later, in 1971. The ball powder ammunition was modified with new buffer systems to reduce the cyclic rate of fire. Cleaning kits were manufactured and distributed. Not just distributed, but designed to fit inside a storage compartment built into the buttstock of the rifle. Training programs were developed. Soldiers were taught how to maintain the M16. They were taught how to clean it. They were taught that it was not self-cleaning. The modified rifle was designated the M16A1. It had the forward assist. It had the chrome-plated chamber. It had the redesigned buffer system. It had the storage compartment for cleaning supplies, and it worked. By 1968, the malfunction rates plummeted. Soldiers who received the M16A1 and proper training reported satisfaction with the weapon. A Department of Defense survey in 1968 found that 85% of soldiers preferred the M16 over the M14. The rifle had been fixed, but the damage to its reputation was permanent. Thousands of soldiers had already served with the original defective M16. They had seen their friends die. They had experienced the terror of a jammed weapon in combat, and they would never trust the rifle again. Even after the modifications, even after the improvements, the M16 carried a stigma. Veterans would tell their stories. They would warn new soldiers. They would pass down the mistrust from one generation to the next. The M16 had been redeemed in function, but not in memory. And here is the part that should enrage everyone who learns this story. Nobody was punished. Not the Army officials who ignored the warnings. Not the contractors who cut corners. Not the generals who perpetuated the myth of the self-cleaning rifle. The I-Cord Committee's report was filed, changes were made, and the bureaucracy moved on. The men who died holding jammed rifles were just statistics. The families who lost sons and husbands received condolence letters that never mentioned the rifle failures. The institutional memory was carefully managed. The narrative became that the M16 had teething problems that were quickly resolved. The truth that the failures were preventable and caused by negligence and cost-cutting was buried in congressional archives. Even Eugene Stoner, the man whose design had been sabotaged by the very institution that adopted it, received no apology. He left Colt. He went to work for other companies. He designed other weapons, including the Stoner 63 weapon system and later the SR-25 sniper rifle. He died in 1997. In interviews late in his life, he remained bitter about what had been done to the AR-15. He knew it had been a good design. He knew it had been ruined by people who should have known better. And he knew that soldiers had died because of it. The Long Shadow. The M16 went on to become one of the most successful military rifles in history. The M16A1 served through the rest of the Vietnam War. It was upgraded to the M16A2 in the 1980s with improved sights, a heavier barrel, and 3-round burst instead of full automatic. The M16A4 added rail systems for optics and accessories. The M4 carbine, a shortened version, became the standard infantry weapon in the 2000s. More than 8 million M16 and M4 rifles have been produced. The design has been adopted by dozens of countries. The civilian semi-automatic version, the AR-15, has become the most popular rifle in America. The platform has proved itself reliable, accurate, and versatile. But the early failures in Vietnam cast a shadow that has never fully lifted. To this day, there are veterans who will not own an AR-15. There are former soldiers who remember the terror of a jammed M16 and will never trust the platform again. The mythology of the unreliable M16 persists in movies, in books, in oral histories passed down through families. New soldiers are still told war stories about rifles that failed in the jungle. The institutional trauma was that deep. And the lessons? The lessons were supposed to be learned. The Pentagon was supposed to reform its acquisition process. Weapons were supposed to be tested more thoroughly. Soldiers were supposed to be consulted. Warnings were supposed to be heeded. But the same patterns repeated themselves. Decades later, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers complained about malfunctioning equipment, inadequate armor, and weapons that did not perform as advertised. The bureaucracy had not changed. The cost-cutting had not stopped. The arrogance of the acquisition system had not been humbled. The story of the M16 in Vietnam is not just a story about a rifle, it is a story about what happens when institutions prioritize convenience and cost over the lives of the men they send into combat. It is a story about how warnings from experts are ignored when they contradict established doctrine. It is a story about how the truth gets buried beneath layers of bureaucratic denial. And it is a story about how young men pay the ultimate price for the failures of old men in offices far from the battlefield. The human cost that can never be calculated. We will never know exactly how many American soldiers died because their M16 rifles jammed. The military did not track that statistic. There was no line on the casualty reports for killed due to weapon malfunction. But we know it happened. We have the letters. We have the testimony. We have the congressional record. We know that Marines were found dead with cleaning rods stuck in their rifles. We know that soldiers threw away their M16 and picked up AK-47s. We know that the malfunction rate in some units reached catastrophic levels. We know that lives were lost. Some estimates suggest that the M16 failures may have contributed to hundreds or even thousands of deaths. But these are only estimates. The true number is unknowable. What we do know is that every single one of those deaths was preventable. If the Army had listened to Eugene Stoner about the ammunition, if they had authorized chrome plating from the beginning, if they had issued cleaning kits, if they had provided proper training, if they had not rushed a weapon into service to meet political and bureaucratic timelines, if any one of these failures had been corrected, lives would have been saved. Think about that. Think about a young man, 19 years old, from a small town in Ohio or Texas or California. He had been drafted. He had gone through basic training. He had been told he was going to Vietnam to fight communism, to defend freedom, to protect the South Vietnamese people. He was handed an M16 rifle and told it was the best weapon in the world. He believed it because he trusted his government. He trusted his military. He trusted the men who gave the orders. And then one day, in a jungle clearing or a rice paddy or a village on the edge of nowhere, the enemy opened fire. He raised his rifle. He pulled the trigger. Click! The rifle jammed. He tried to clear it. The brass case was stuck. He reached for a cleaning rod he did not have. He looked up. The enemy was advancing. In his last moments, he understood that he had been betrayed, not by the enemy, by his own military, by the institutions that were supposed to protect him, by the bureaucrats who chose cost savings over his life. This happened multiple times, across multiple years, and nobody in the chain of command who allowed it to happen faced any consequences. They retired with pensions, they received medals and commendations, they wrote memoirs that glossed over the failures, they were honored as leaders and patriots. Meanwhile, the men who died holding jammed rifles are names on a wall in Washington, D.C. Their families received folded flags and condolence letters written by staff officers who never mentioned that their sons and husbands had died because of preventable equipment failures. The institutional betrayal. The deeper you dig into the M16 story, the more you realize it was not just about one weapon. It was about an entire system that had lost its way. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense who ordered the adoption of the M16, was a man in love with data and systems analysis. He believed that war could be won through statistical analysis and efficiency metrics. He believed that the best decisions came from spreadsheets and computer models. But he failed to understand the human dimension. He failed to understand that when you make decisions about weapon systems, You are making decisions about whether young men live or die. McNamara knew about the deficiencies in the M16 before he ordered its adoption. The reports were on his desk. He knew about the lack of chrome plating. He knew about the ammunition concerns. But he ordered the rifle into production anyway, because the M14 production could not keep up with demand, and because the AR-15 was the only rifle available that could meet the requirement for a universal infantry weapon. He made a calculated decision. He weighed the risks. He decided that the potential benefits outweighed the known deficiencies. And he was wrong. The Army generals who resisted the AR-15 and then sabotaged its implementation were protecting their own institutional interests. They had invested careers in the M14. They had built doctrine around heavy firepower and marksmanship at range. The AR-15 represented a rejection of everything they believed. So they fought it. And when they lost the political battle and were forced to adopt it, they complied in the most minimal way possible. They made the changes that were absolutely required, and nothing more. They did not champion the weapon. They did not ensure it would succeed. They set it up to fail. And when it failed, they blamed the soldiers for not maintaining it properly. Colt, the manufacturer, was complicit in its own way. They marketed the rifle as self-cleaning. They knew it was not self-cleaning. No rifle is self-cleaning. But the marketing language was effective. It made the Army's life easier. It allowed them to skip the expense and time of developing cleaning kits and training programs. Colt wanted the contract. They wanted the money. And they were willing to make claims about the rifle that were not entirely accurate to get that contract. When soldiers started dying, Colt pointed fingers at the Army for changing the ammunition. The Army pointed fingers at Colt for not chrome-plating the chamber. Everyone pointed fingers at everyone else. Nobody accepted responsibility. The Olin Corporation, which manufactured the ball powder ammunition, claimed their product met specifications. And it did on paper. The velocity was correct. The pressure was within acceptable ranges. What they failed to account for was how the dirtier burning powder would interact with the rifle's gas system over extended use in field conditions. They ran their tests in laboratories with clean rifles. They did not simulate combat conditions. They did not consider the cumulative effects of hundreds of rounds fired without cleaning. They delivered a product that technically met the contract specifications, but was fundamentally unsuited for the application, and they faced no consequences. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the story. Every institution, every individual involved, found ways to shift blame and avoid accountability. The system was designed to protect itself, not the soldiers who depended on it. And when the crisis became impossible to ignore, the fixes were implemented quietly. There were no public apologies. There were no admissions of wrongdoing. There were technical modifications and updated training manuals, and everyone moved on as if the deaths had been an unfortunate but unavoidable byproduct of wartime logistics. The lessons we still have not learned. In 2003, American soldiers deployed to Iraq. Many of them carried M16A2 rifles and M4 carbines. These were mature, reliable weapons. The bugs had been worked out decades earlier, but soldiers started reporting problems, not with the rifles themselves, but with the magazines. The aluminum magazines that had been in service since the 1960s were wearing out. Feed lips were bent. Springs were weak. Soldiers were experiencing failures to feed. They requested new magazines. The request was denied because replacement magazines had not been budgeted. Soldiers began buying their own magazines with their own money. They shipped them to themselves in care packages from home. The military eventually caught up and issued new magazines, but for months, soldiers in combat were using worn-out equipment because the logistics system had not kept pace with operational demand. In Afghanistan, soldiers complained about the performance of the M4 carbine in mountain combat. The shorter barrel reduced velocity. The lighter weight made the weapon harder to control in full automatic. Soldiers wanted to return to the full-length M16. The requests went up, the chain of command, they were denied. The M4 was the standard. Doctrine had been written. The institutional momentum could not be reversed. Eventually, special operations units were allowed to adopt different weapons platforms, but the regular infantry was stuck with what they had. These are not the same scale of failure as the M16 crisis in Vietnam, but they demonstrate that the underlying problems persist. The acquisition system is still slow to respond to soldier feedback. Cost considerations still override operational concerns. Institutional inertia still resists change, even when change is clearly needed. The bureaucracy still protects itself above all else. The difference now is that soldiers have more ways to make their voices heard. Social media allows frontline troops to share their experiences directly with the public. Investigative journalists can access information more easily. Congressional oversight is more robust. But the fundamental dynamic remains. The people who make decisions about equipment are not the people who use that equipment in combat, and the gap between those two groups creates opportunities for catastrophic failures. Why this story matters now. The M16 failure in Vietnam happened more than 50 years ago. Most of the men who carried those rifles are now in their 70s or have passed away. The institutional players are long retired or dead. Eugene Stoner died in 1997. Robert McNamara died in 2009. The ICORD Committee's findings are archived and largely forgotten. So why does this story still matter? It matters because the pattern has not been broken. It matters because the lessons have not been fully learned. It matters because every time the military deploys a new weapon system, there is a risk that the same failures will repeat themselves. The Army is currently in the process of fielding a new rifle, the M7, which uses a new cartridge and a new operating system. The early reports are promising, but the test is not in the laboratory. The test is in combat. Will the rifle work when it gets dirty? Will the ammunition perform in extreme environments? Will soldiers receive adequate training? Will cleaning supplies and spare parts be available in the supply chain? Will field feedback be taken seriously or dismissed as user error? These are the questions that should be asked every time a new weapon system is introduced. These are the lessons of the M16. The story also matters because it is a reminder of the covenant between the military and the soldiers who serve. When a young person joins the military, they are making an agreement. They agree to risk their life in service of their country. In exchange, their country agrees to provide them with the training, the equipment, and the support they need to survive and succeed. When the military issues faulty equipment and fails to correct known deficiencies, they are breaking that covenant. They are betraying the trust that soldiers place in them, and that betrayal has consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Veterans carry the memory of that betrayal. They pass it down to their children and grandchildren. They tell stories about the rifles that jammed. They warn about trusting the government. They become cynical about institutional competence. This cynicism is corrosive. It undermines military cohesion. It makes recruiting harder. It damages the relationship between the military and the society it serves. The M16 failures in Vietnam contributed to the broader crisis of confidence in the military that marked the 1970s and 1980s. The institution's reputation took decades to rebuild, all because they failed to fix a problem they knew existed. The legacy of the AR platform. Despite its troubled beginnings, the AR-15 platform that Eugene Stoner designed has become one of the most successful and influential firearms in history. The M16 and M4 have served the United States military for more than 60 years. The platform has been adopted by militaries and law enforcement agencies in more than 80 countries. The civilian AR-15 has become ubiquitous in American gun culture. It is used for target shooting, hunting, home defense, and competition. More than 20 million AR-15 style rifles are owned by American civilians. The design has spawned countless variants and improvements. The AR-15's modularity has allowed it to evolve with changing technology. The original rifle had a fixed carrying handle and iron sights. Modern versions have flat-top receivers with Picatinny rails that allow mounting of optics, lasers, lights, and other accessories. The basic operating system remains the same, but everything else can be customized. Barrels can be swapped for different lengths and calibers. Triggers can be upgraded. Stocks can be adjusted for different body types and shooting positions. The AR-15 has become a platform rather than a specific rifle, adaptable to almost any application. This success is a testament to the fundamental soundness of Stoner's original design. The rifle works when it is made correctly, when it is fed the right ammunition, when it is maintained properly. It is reliable, accurate, and effective. The failures in Vietnam were not because the design was flawed. They were because the implementation was botched. This distinction is critical. The M16 crisis was not an engineering failure, it was an institutional failure. And that makes it worse because engineering failures can be fixed with better design. Institutional failures require changing culture, processes, and attitudes. That is much harder. The AR-15 platform has also benefited from continuous improvement by the civilian market. Because the design is no longer protected by patents, hundreds of manufacturers produce AR-15 parts and complete rifles. Competition has driven innovation. Better barrels, better triggers, better bolt carrier groups, better magazines. The current generation of AR-15 rifles is more reliable and more accurate than the original M16 could ever have been. This is how a free market is supposed to work. This is the opposite of the bureaucratic acquisition system that botched the M16 introduction. But even with all these improvements, with all the success, the stigma remains. There are still people who believe the M16 is unreliable. There are still veterans who will not touch an AR-15 because of what they experienced in Vietnam. The reputational damage done between 1965 and 1967 has echoes that persist to this day. It is a reminder that trust, once broken, is very hard to rebuild. The final reckoning here is what you need to understand. The M16 did not fail in Vietnam. The institutions responsible for fielding the M16 failed. The rifle, as designed by Eugene Stoner, was a revolutionary piece of engineering that would have performed admirably if the Army had followed the design specifications, if they had used the correct ammunition, if they had chrome-plated the chamber, if they had issued cleaning kits, and if they had trained soldiers properly. But they did none of these things. They cut corners. They ignored warnings. They prioritized cost and speed over the lives of the soldiers who would carry the weapon. And when the weapon failed, they blamed the soldiers. This is not ancient history. This is not a story about primitive technology or the ignorance of a bygone era. This happened in the 1960s, in the most technologically advanced military in the world. It happened despite clear warnings from the weapons designer. It happened despite field reports documenting the failures. It happened despite congressional oversight. It happened because the system was designed to resist change, to protect institutional interests, and to avoid accountability. The men who died holding jammed M16 rifles deserved better. They deserved a military that took their safety seriously. They deserved leaders who listened to warnings and acted on them. They deserved equipment that worked. They did not get any of those things. Instead, they got a rifle that had been deliberately degraded by cost-cutting and bureaucratic arrogance. And when they paid the price for those decisions with their lives, the institutions responsible closed ranks and moved on. The M16 story is a warning. It is a warning about what happens when institutions lose sight of their purpose. It is a warning about the dangers of arrogance and willful ignorance. It is a warning about the human cost of bureaucratic failure. And it is a warning that we ignore at our peril, because the same dynamics that caused the M16 crisis are still present in the military acquisition system today. So when you see an AR-15, when you read about the M16, when you hear veterans tell stories about rifles that jammed in Vietnam, remember this. The gun was not the problem. The gun worked. It was the people who managed the gun, who modified it, who supplied it, and who fielded it without proper support. Those are the people who failed. And the soldiers who died because of those failures deserved a reckoning that they never got. That is the untold story of the M16 in Vietnam. It was not about a bad rifle. It was about a bad system. And the tragedy is that we have not yet fixed that system. We have only learned to hide its failures better.